They swore before the whole household that she had poisoned the heir, and the young gentlewoman they branded a murderess could have named the true poisoner with a single breath and did not, because the one proof that would clear her lay locked in a strong box in London to which she alone held the key, and she did not yet know it. Honoria Fenwick was 24 years old and gently reared and poor, a lady in all but fortune and a servant by necessity, earning her bread as the still-room mistress and keeper of the medicine chest in a cold, exacting ancient family in a great house at the edge of the fells, and on a raw bright morning in the autumn of that year the whole weight of that house came down upon her at once. When the master's ailing brother, the heir of the house, was found sinking and dying of a secret poison, and the household, one after another, turned its eyes upon the friendless young woman who mixed the sick man's draughts, and kept his physic, and had no one in the world to speak for her. She had not poisoned him. She had watched over him and eased his pain with all the tender skill her father had taught her. But she was poor, and alone, and a stranger of no family that anyone there need respect, and the man who had truly poisoned the heir, and taken good care that the blame should fall exactly where it fell, was the smooth, plausible, indispensable physician of the house, Dr. Cyprian Vole, a poor kinsman who attended all its sick and stood next in the blood after the failing heir, and who had murdered the invalid himself to come into the inheritance, and framed the healer to hide the crime and to be rid, into the bargain, of the one person under that roof whose dead father had once held the proof of his earlier murder. And so Honoria Fenwick stood accused before them all, confined a prisoner, her name a byword for a poisoner, faced with the very real shadow of the gallows, and she could prove nothing, and no one would believe her. And she did not yet know that the plain worn herbal she kept always by her father's last gift, a thing of pure sentiment that Cyprian Vole and all that cold house passed over as beneath a poisoner's notice, held folded behind one faded pressed flower the one key that could unlock the strong box in London where her father's careful love had hidden both the proof that she was no poisoner, and the proof that Cyprian Vole was, nor that the cold proud man who ruled that house, and who had at first believed the worst of her with the rest, would be the one to fetch that truth up into the light before a magistrate and the whole assembled household on the very day her ruin was to be made complete. It was the middle of October, and the fells were going brown and gold under a hard clear sky, when the heir was found dying and Honoria Fenwick's world came down. And that grey autumn is where the turning of her story begins. Though the murder that made it necessary had been weeks in the quiet making in the hands of Cyprian Vole, I have been waiting a long time to tell you Honoria's story. The poisoned heir and the false accusation and the smooth murderer who meant to see her hang for his own crime, and the plain worn book of weeds by her side that held the key to it all, and the cold hard man who first believed her guilty and then came to see her true, and to break the frame that had been built around her. So settle in, and stay close by her side through what is coming, because a young gentlewoman who has been called a poisoner before the whole household she served, and shut up to wait for the law, and made to feel the gallows cold breath on her neck with no friend to speak for her and no proof she can lay her hand on, is about to find that her gentle, foreseeing father saw the danger long before it came, and left her, folded small behind a pressed flower in a thing no schemer would ever trouble to search, the means to undo the whole false design, and what she does when at last the strong box is opened and her own truth is read out before the very people who thought they had her ruined is a thing worth staying for to the very end. But to understand how a gently reared young woman came to stand accused of a murder she never dreamed of, in a house where she had served faithfully and healed the sick and been trusted, with her name blackened and the law itself gathering against her, you have to understand what had been done to her, and how it was ever possible, and who did it. For the cruelty of her story turns on a thing that has ruined more honest servants in more great houses than any open violence ever did, which is the ease with which the poor and the friendless may be made to bear the crimes of the plausible and the powerful, and the strange readiness of the comfortable world to believe the worst of anyone who has nothing. She had not always been poor, and that is the first thing to know of her, for it made the fall so much the harder to bear. She was the only child of Mr. Reuben Fenwick, a gentleman of the middling sort, a man of no great estate but of real learning and a warm and honest heart, who had lived quietly in a pleasant house in a market town, and had spent his modest means and his whole strength upon the thing he loved, which was the healing of the sick. He was an apothecary and a physician, but he was more than the common run of either, for he had a deep true knowledge of his craft, of simples and salts and the making and the meddling of medicines, and a shrewd humane eye for a symptom, and above all an honesty that would not be bought, and though he was never rich, for he physicked half the poor of the town for nothing and never called in a debt that would have pinched a struggling family, he had made himself, in that one field, a man of standing and of consequence, whose word on a doubtful draught or a suspicious death was worth more than another man's oath, and more than many a grander doctor's swagger. He had married for love a gentle, clever, delicate lady, and had lost her young when their daughter was but 8, and the loss had grieved him deeply and turned him tender and careful. And thereafter he had bound himself more closely than ever to the motherless girl who was all he had left of the wife he had loved. He kept her by him, and taught her himself, far beyond the common run of a girl's schooling. She read with him, and worked with him in his still room, and learned from him to know a true thing from a false one, a good drug from a bad, a natural sickness from a meddled one, the marks and the signs and the little honesties by which a healer reads the truth of a body and a bottle. And she grew into a young woman of unusual cultivation and unusual discernment, quiet and grave and deeply taught, with a clear steady eye and a habit of looking at a thing until she understood it, and a modest reserved manner that hid, from all but those who knew her well, the strength and the fine trained intelligence beneath. She was no fine lady to be idle and admired. She was her learned father's pupil and fellow worker, and she had learned from him, without knowing how much she would one day need it, to see clearly, and to keep her own counsel, and to trust the evidence of her own careful eyes, and her own trained senses above the loud opinions of the world. And her father, loving her and knowing that he could leave her little, had given her, in place of a fortune, 2 things that he believed would serve her better: a mind and a skill that could earn their bread with credit anywhere, and one plain precious thing that he charged her very gravely to keep always by her. For Reuben Fenwick in his last years knew that he was failing, and that he would leave her poor and friendless in a hard world, and though he faced it without bitterness, being a man of sense, he was uneasy, in a way he could not quite name, about a world in which a portionless gentlewoman of no family and no protector was a creature strangely without defense, at the mercy of any powerful person's malice, with no one to take her part. And so he had done, quietly and in his last months, a careful thing, the most careful thing of his life. And I will come to it, for it is the hinge of everything. He gave her, near the end, the one thing he charged her above all to keep: his own old herbal, the worn book of simples he had made and added to all his healing life, close written in his own small hand and interleaved with the pressed flowers and leaves of a lifetime's country walks and country cures. And he bade her keep it always by her, in her still room and her work, and never part with it, and keep it safe. And he told her, holding her hands and looking at her very gravely, that it was more than it seemed, and that if ever she were in a true extremity, alone and wronged and without other help, she was to look behind the pressed flower he named to her, where he had set something for her, and do exactly what she found there written, and trust it, and tell no one until she must. She had thought it, at the time, only the tender fancy of a dying father who could not bear to leave his motherless girl unguarded. She had not looked. She had not been in any extremity then, only grieving. But she had kept the old herbal faithfully ever since, by her in all her work, and she would have need of it now. For her father died when she was 24 of a slow decline, and left her, as he had known he must, very poor. And Honoria Fenwick, who had never in her life had to think of money, found herself alone in the world with a little furniture and her father's books and instruments, most of the small savings gone to the last of his charities and his debts, and the plain hard necessity before her of earning her own bread. She met it, as she met everything, quietly and with courage. She had no near relations to turn to, and no fortune, and no protector, but she had her cultivation and her healer's skill and her good name and her steady sense, and she did the only thing a gentlewoman so placed and so trained could decently do. She sought, and after a little while she found a respectable upper situation, a place as still-room mistress and keeper of the medicine chest, in a household that wanted just such a person, gentle and skilled and cheap, to order its physic and nurse its sick. And the household she came to, in the late spring of that year, was the great house of the Ashworths on the edge of the northern fells, the seat of the Baronets of Cairnhow. And there, all unknowing, she walked into the place where her ruin was waiting. The family she came to serve was an old one, cold and proud and much reduced, clinging to its ancient consequence in a house too large and too costly for its shrunken means. The head of it was Sir Marcus Ashworth, the young baronet of Cairnhow, a grave, hard, silent man of some 35 who had come young to a burdened title and a tangled estate and had spent his manhood in the cold hard business of trying to keep the old house and the old name from going wholly under. But the heart of the household's anxious care, the life about which everything in those days turned, was the baronet's younger brother, Mr. Lucian Ashworth, a gentle, cultivated, failing gentleman of some 40 years, long an invalid, who lived quietly in the best rooms of the great house, and was kept alive, from month to month, on careful physic and careful nursing. He was the heir, for Sir Marcus had never married and had no child, and by the settlement of the estate it was his brother Lucian, and after Lucian the next of that dwindling blood who stood to come into Cairnhow. Lucian Ashworth was a mild, sweet-tempered, patient sufferer, beloved by the few who knew him well, bearing his long weakness without complaint, and it was to order his medicines, and to nurse him, and to keep the still room and the great chest of drugs on which his frail life leaned, that Honoria Fenwick was chiefly engaged. She did it well, and tenderly, and with a skill that eased the poor gentleman's suffering as no rough hired nurse had done, and the invalid came to trust and to value her, and to look for her quiet step and her gentle hand, so that within a few months the still-room mistress had a place of trust and of affection in the sick room that a friendless young woman was glad of, and that was to be turned, by a cleverer and colder head than any in that house, into the very rope to hang her. For she kept the medicines, she mixed the draughts, she had the run of the sick room and the keeping of the chest. And there is no one so easy to hang for a poisoning as the one whose hand is on the physic. For over the health of that failing house, and over the frail heir on whom its whole succession hung, there presided one man, and that man was the true author of everything that came upon Honoria Fenwick, and it is time to know him. His name was Dr. Cyprian Vole, and he was the resident physician, the medical attendant, the trusted confidant of the Ashworths, a distant poor kinsman of the family who had made himself, over a dozen patient years, indispensable to it. He was a smooth, plausible, comfortable-looking man of about 48, with a soft, grave voice and a ready, reassuring manner and an air of learned, devoted care that had won and kept the trust of the whole family. The old baronet relied on him utterly in all that touched his brother's health. Lucian Ashworth put his frail life in the doctor's hands without a doubt, and the household one and all thought Dr. Vole the very soul of faithful skill. And he was a ruined and a desperate man. For all his comfortable exterior, Cyprian Vole had a secret vice and a secret ruin. He was a gamester, deep and helpless, and had been for years, and had lost, at the tables and on the turf, far more than a physician's fees could ever cover, until he was sunk in debts, secret and pressing and shameful, that he dared not confess and could not pay. He had kept the surface smooth by borrowings and shifts and the slow bleeding of what little he could come by. But by that autumn he had reached a crisis. His creditors, or one dangerous creditor among them, had grown hard and pressed him. There was to be, that winter, a reckoning he could not for once put off or hide, a matter of a bond fallen due, and a threat of exposure that would strip him bare before the family that trusted him and ruin him past all mending. And Cyprian Vole saw, with a cold, clear terror behind his grave and comfortable face, that unless he could find, quickly, a great sum of money or a great change in his fortunes, his whole long secret ruin was about to come to light, and with it the loss of his place, his practice, his character, and everything he had. He needed a fortune, and he needed it soon, and there was within his reach one way and one only, that a fortune might be had. For Cyprian Vole was next in the blood. After the failing invalid Lucien, whom he attended and whose frail life hung upon his physic, there stood, by the thin chances of that dwindling family, no one nearer to the succession of Cairnhow than the poor cousin who was its doctor, and if once that one ailing life were gone, Cyprian Vole, and no other, would be the heir. One life stood between Cyprian Vole and everything, and that life lay, month after month, in his own physicking hands. And so Cyprian Vole, cornered and desperate beneath his calm, resolved upon the boldest and the wickedest stroke of his whole wicked career. He would murder the heir. He would use his physic and his trust and his skill to hurry that ailing gentleman, whom the world already thought slowly dying, a little faster and a little surer into the grave that seemed so near him anyway. He would do it by a slow secret poison, cunningly given, that should look like nothing but the natural sinking of a long disease. And he would come into the inheritance that would cover his debts and save his neck and make him master of Cairnhow. But he was too clever, and too careful, and too cold to trust wholly to the poison passing unremarked. For poison, once suspected, is a thing that hunts for a hand, and Cyprian Vole meant that if ever the death were questioned, there should be another hand ready and plain to point to, and no shadow of suspicion should ever come near the faithful doctor who had labored so to save his patient. He had thought it all out, coldly and carefully, as he thought out everything, and he had seen at once who the victim of that second subtler crime must be. It must be someone within the house, with the handling of the sick man's medicines, someone poor and friendless, and of no family or consequence to make a stir or command belief. Someone whose word would weigh as nothing against the grave authority of the physician and the united suspicion of the household, and who could be ruined and given up to the law with no one the wiser and no one to care. And there was, ready to his hand, exactly such a person, the still-room mistress, the portionless gentlewoman Honoria Fenwick, who mixed and carried the invalid's draughts by the doctor's own direction, who kept the chest and had the run of the sick room, who was poor and alone and unprotected, and who would make, in every particular, the perfect poisoner. She was the ideal scapegoat. She might have been designed for it, and Cyprian Vole, looking at the quiet, friendless young woman across the great cold hall, felt no more compunction in planning her ruin than a spider feels for the fly, and laid his plans to fasten his own murder about her neck. But there was more to it, in Cyprian Vole's cold, calculating mind, than the mere convenience of a scapegoat, for it happened by a chance that seemed to him the very finger of his luck, that of all the friendless young women in the world he might have framed, this particular one was the one he had, on his own account, the deadliest private reason to wish destroyed. For Vole had known the name of Fenwick when the new still-room mistress came, and had felt, at the sound of it, a cold start of alarm, and he had looked, narrowly and secretly, and satisfied himself that she was indeed the child of the late Mr. Reuben Fenwick of the market town, the shrewd, honest healer. For years before, in the darker days of his need, Cyprian Vole had done a certain piece of murderous business, a poisoning and a false certificate of a death, that had brought him a legacy he badly wanted, and Reuben Fenwick, honest healer that he was, had come upon the case, and seen through the thing, and come by certain proofs of Vole's guilt. A letter in Vole's own hand that said too much, and the suppressed results of an analysis Vole had thought safely buried, and had kept them, and let Vole know that he held them. So that Vole had gone for years in a cold, buried dread of the man who could bring him to the gallows with a word. Reuben had died, and never used the proofs, being a gentle man with no taste for vengeance, and Vole had breathed again, thinking the danger dead with him. And now here was the man's child, come of all places into the very house where Vole was physician. And he could not for his life be sure how much she knew, or what her father had left her. It was intolerable, it was a standing danger under his own roof, and worse now than ever, for she was a healer with a healer's eye. The one person in that house who might look at a sinking man and a doubtful drought and see what no one else would see. And it turned his cold convenience into a hot private necessity. To frame Honoria for the poisoning would not only find him his scapegoat and his inheritance, it would rid him forever of the one person who had ever held him in her hand. Disgrace her past all believing, and lay the old ghost of his crime forever. It was, he told himself, a masterpiece. And he set about it with the cold thoroughness of a man securing his whole future at a stroke. He was in no hurry, and he made no slip. Through the early autumn he laid his ground with a patient wickedness. He began, quietly and by degrees, to do the thing itself, to substitute, in the careful course of the invalid's physic, his own slow secret poison for the harmless strengthening tincture that Honoria mixed and believed she was giving, so that the medicine which the still-room mistress prepared in all innocence, and which passed through her hands to the sick man, became, by the doctor's secret meddling with the bottles that only he and she had the handling of, the very instrument of the murder. And as he did it, he watched the poor gentleman sink a little faster, with a grave concerned face and a doubling of his tender care, and shook his head over the sad progress of the disease, and prepared the ground of the second crime. He let fall, here and there to this servant and that, and once or twice, gravely and reluctantly to the old baronet himself, small quiet poisonous hints against the still-room mistress, that the young woman, for all her gentle ways, had a strange deep knowledge of drugs, that a person so poor, with the handling of so much that was dangerous and the skill to use it bore watching, that he would not for the world accuse anyone, but that in a house where a valuable life hung on the physic, Sir Marcus would do well to have a care who kept the chest. He did it so softly, with so grave an air of mere faithful prudence, that it seemed the very opposite of malice, but he knew his anxious, fearful old employer, and he knew that he was sowing, in that proud, frightened mind, a slow seed of distrust that would spring up, when the moment came, into instant and unshakable conviction. And he prepared his physical proofs with the same cold art. He had, ready and hidden, a phial of the very poison he was using, and he had, by a small easy theft, a page torn from Honoria's own still-room book, her own notes of the doses she prepared, and these he held by him, against the hour when the heir should die, to plant where a search must find them, in the chest she kept, and the room where she slept, so that the poisoning should look plain and damning, like the guilty work of the woman whose hand was on the physic. And he chose his moment as it were for him, for the poison did its work, and one raw bright October morning the thing came to its head, when Lucian Ashworth, who had been sinking for weeks under the secret dose, was found in the night grievously worse, seized with the plain violent signs of a poison at last no longer to be hidden, and lay dying past all the doctor's showy efforts to save him. And Cyprian Vole, called to the bedside, made his grave and dreadful pronouncement, that these were no natural signs of the poor gentleman's disease, but the signs, he feared, of poison, that someone, God forgive them, had been giving the sick man poison, and that the matter must be looked into at once, for the honor of the house and the sake of justice. And with that word, spoken gravely and reluctantly by the trusted physician over the dying heir, the whole cold machinery of the frame was set in motion, exactly as Cyprian Vole had planned it, and it turned, straight and pitiless, upon Honoria Fenwick. For the word ran through the house like fire that the heir had been poisoned, and the great house was thrown into an uproar of horror and alarm. And from the very first moment, guided by the slow poison of weeks that Vole had been dropping, and by the grave hints he now let fall, every eye and every suspicion turned upon the poor friendless healer who had mixed the sick man's draughts and kept his physic, the old baronet, his mind wild with the loss of his brother and the horror of murder under his roof, and his mind long since prepared by the doctor's whisperings, seized upon Honoria's guilt at once, with the unreasoning certainty of a frightened man who wants a culprit and has been taught where to find one, and he accused her, to her face, before the assembled household, in a passion of grief and dread, of being a poisoner and a viper he had taken into his house, a beggarly nobody who had murdered the master's brother by the very physic she was trusted to give. And Honoria Fenwick, struck to the heart, white and trembling with the shock and the horror of it, denied it, steadily and truthfully and with all the plain force of an honest soul. She had not poisoned him, she said. She had given him nothing but what the doctor himself directed. She had nursed and eased him with her whole heart and would have died to save him. She was no murderess, but she set it into a wall of cold disbelief, for the household had already made up its mind, and her very skill, and her very poverty and friendlessness, that should have moved them to doubt, were taken instead as the proof of her guilt. And then Dr. Vole gravely, reluctantly, as one performing a painful duty, suggested that in fairness to all, and to come at the dreadful truth, the still-room mistress's chest and room should be searched. And the search was made, and in the medicine chest that she kept, thrust behind the honest bottles, they found a phial of the very poison that had killed the heir, and in her room, among her own papers, they found a page torn from her still-room book with the doses of the sick man's draughts noted in her own hand. And that was the end of Honoria Fenwick, so far as belief or mercy went, for there was the poison in her own chest and her own notes of the fatal draughts. And what more could any reasonable person want? The find was taken for certain proof. Her denials became, in every ear, the mere brazen lying of a murderess caught red-handed, and the whole cold house closed against her, united and satisfied and pitiless, in the settled conviction that the poor healer had poisoned the heir and been justly found out. And here, before I tell you how far the ruin ran and how low the world brought her, I must ask one thing of you, because everything in Honoria's story is about to begin, quietly, to turn, and I would not want you to miss the turning. If you've made it this far into Honoria Fenwick's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. That is the only time I will ask. Now stay close by her side, for she is about to be more alone than she has ever been in her life, and to learn how little the truth is worth to a comfortable world that has already decided against the poor. And she was very much alone in it, which was the bitterest part of the whole bitter business, for there was no one in that cold house, or in all the country round, to whom she could turn or who would think to doubt. The tale ran out into the neighborhood before the day was well begun, carried by the servants and colored by Vole's grave, regretful tongue. And it lost nothing in the telling. The poor still-room mistress, the beggarly nobody the good old Baronet had charitably taken in, had repaid her master's kindness by poisoning his own brother with the very physic she was trusted to give, and had been caught with the poison in her own chest. And the comfortable world that heard it believed it, easily, and at once, as it always believes the worst of those who have nothing, for a poisoner who is poor and friendless and has, moreover, the dreadful cleverness of a knowledge of drugs, is the most natural thing in the world, and no one need trouble to look twice. The great ladies of the county, who had thought the apothecary's portionless daughter a very good sort of person while she was useful and quiet, discovered now that they had always felt there was something not quite to be trusted about her. "I am never deceived in a face," said Mrs. Prudence Gorse, a plump, complacent lady who had never in her life looked below one, nodding over her tea. There was a boldness in that young woman's eye, for all her still ways, and a deal too much book learning of the wrong sort. I own I never liked it. And handsome cold Lady Cassandra Mead, who had a way of pitying people cruelly, said it was very shocking, but that one really could not wonder, that these decayed gentlefolk who dabbled in physic were always the worst, made dangerous by a little knowledge, and that it was a lesson against trusting one's health to such persons at all. Not one of them thought to ask whether the thing were even true, or to wonder whether a friendless creature found guilty in an hour on the word of a doctor and a single phial were not the very person a real poisoner would choose to hide behind. They had their culprit, and their comfortable thrill of horror, and they turned their backs, all of them, and left Honoria Fenwick to her ruin. So that she learned in that one day how very solitary a wronged creature may be who is poor, and has no name that anyone need respect, and no one at all to believe her. And Honoria Fenwick stood in the midst of them. Ruin she saw. In that dreadful hour the whole shape of the thing that had fallen on her, though she did not yet know the hand that had built it. She saw the file in the housekeeper's palm, and the torn page in the doctor's hand, and the cold certainty in every face, and the impossibility of making one soul there believe the truth. And she understood, with a sick sinking of the heart, that she was lost, that her word was worth nothing against that damning find, that she had not a friend in the house nor a proof in the world, and that she stood, a gently reared and honest woman, branded a common poisoner before them all, with disgrace certain and the gallows itself a near and dreadful possibility. For it was no light thing, in that age, to be taken for the poisoning of a man. It was the blackest of crimes. And it was death. Plain and certain death by the rope, with no mercy and no reprieve for a servant caught poisoning the master's kin. And the shadow of that dreadful end lay cold across her from the first moment. She was not turned out, as a mere thief might have been. She was worse placed than that, for hers was a hanging matter, and she was confined, shut up under lock and guard in a cold upper room of the great house, to be kept close until the magistrate could be sent for and the law set in motion and she carried off to the county gaol to await her trial and her death. She was a prisoner, disgraced and broken, shut up alone with the certainty of her ruin and the near dread of the gallows, with nowhere to turn and no one to believe her, and the brand of a murderess upon her forever. And she had, though she scarcely thought of it in that first black hour, one plain worn thing that they had not thought to take from her, that no one had thought worth the taking. One last gift of her father's love and his life's work, waiting by her for exactly such a day as this. For she had, always, the herbal. It stood among her few poor things, where the searchers had turned it over and tossed it aside, her father's old book of simples, the worn gray boarded volume close written in his own small hand and thick with the pressed flowers and leaves of all his healing years. It was the last gift of the father she had loved, and the dearest working thing she owned, and a thing of pure and precious sentiment. And when in the search the servants had turned over her few poor possessions, hunting for poison and papers, they had glanced at the shabby old book of dried weeds and country recipes, and tossed it by, for what was a pauper healer's book of simples worth to people hunting the proofs of a murder? It was beneath their notice, and beneath Cyprian Voles, who reckoned everything by its danger to himself and saw in the worn old herbal only a keepsake of no account, and that contempt, though none of them knew it, was exactly why it was safe. But as Honoria sat in her locked cold room, in the first dreadful stillness after the storm, her thoughts went, as they always did in her trouble, to her father, and there came back to her, with a strange new and piercing weight, the thing he had told her, long ago, in his last weeks, and that she had put by as a dying man's tender fancy and never thought of since. He had held her hands, she remembered, and looked at her very gravely, and had said that the old herbal was more than it seemed, that if ever she should find herself in a true extremity, alone and wronged, and without other help, she was to look behind the pressed flower he named to her, where he had set something for her, and to do exactly what she found there written, and trust it, and tell no one until she must. She had thought it then only the sweet sad anxiety of a father who could not bear to leave his motherless girl unguarded. She had not looked, she had never been in any extremity, she had been safe. But she was in a true extremity now, wronged past all bearing and alone and shut up to die, and sitting there in the cold locked room her father's grave face rose before her and his strange words. And she thought, with a sudden trembling of the heart, he set something behind the pressed flower. He told me to look, in a true extremity. And I am in a true extremity now. And here I must tell you the thing that neither Honoria nor Cyprian Vole nor all that cold house knew. The careful secret thing that Reuben Fenwick had done in his last months and told almost no one, for it is the hinge of the whole story and the answer to the perfect frame. Reuben Fenwick, in the last year of his life, knowing he would leave his only child poor and friendless in a hard world, had resolved to leave her, against any evil day, one hidden line of defense that no ordinary malice could reach or spoil. And he had had, moreover, one particular unquiet thought. For he had never forgotten Cyprian Vole. He had the proofs of Vole's old murder, the letter in Vole's own hand and the suppressed analysis, and had kept them by him, and in his last illness he had had a careful healer's instinct that those old proofs of a living murderer's guilt ought not to perish with him, but ought to be preserved, safe and ready, in case they should ever be needed against the man. And so he did a quiet and a careful thing. He gathered the proofs of Vole's old crime, and he made, with his own hand and his own skill, a fresh dated memorandum of the whole poisoning he had detected, and a plain written analysis of just how such a draught might be, and had been secretly meddled with, that any honest chemist could confirm. And he gathered, too, certain vouchers of his child's good character, and he lodged the whole, sealed up, in a strong box with an honest and independent London chemist and analyst of his own choosing, a man of unimpeachable character named Mr. Josiah Wenlock, wholly unconnected with anyone who might one day wrong her, with a solemn charge that the box be given up to no one but his child or one bearing the token he named. And the token, and the key to the whole, he had hidden in the one place he was sure would stay always with her, and that no schemer's hand would ever think worth searching, folded small behind one pressed and faded flower in his old herbal, the plain book of weeds he bade her keep always by her. He had set a slip of thin paper in his own hand, giving the name and the street of that London chemist and the number of that sealed box, and a word of direction, that this was her surety, her father's provision against any evil day, and that she was to send to that house and open that box if ever she stood in need of what it held. He had made a shabby old book of simples the key to a strong box. He had hidden her vindication and a murderer's ruin behind a faded pressed flower. And then he had died, trusting that if ever the worst came, she would remember, and look, and be armed. And the worst had come, and for a while in her grief she had not remembered, or had remembered only as a sad sweet fancy, until now, shut up, and branded and desperate, she remembered her father's grave face and his strange words, and her thoughts crept to the worn old book among her poor things, and she thought, he set something behind the pressed flower. And I am in a true extremity now. But before she could look, and before I can tell you what came of it, I must bring into the tale the man who was to be. Though neither of them could then have dreamed it, the breaker of the frame and the answer to her ruin, for on that very day of her disgrace, all unknowing, the cold master of the house was drawn, by the ugliness of the thing done under his own roof, out of the settled indifference in which he had first let her be condemned, and to understand why he of all that hard household was the one who would not in the end let the wrong stand, and why he came to see the truth when everyone about him was so sure of the lie. You must understand who he was, for the world had him quite wrong, as it usually has such men. Sir Marcus Ashworth, the Baronet of Cairnhow, a man of some 35, was reckoned, by the county that knew him a little and liked him less, a cold, hard, proud and disagreeable man, grave and silent and unsmiling, with a level dark eye that gave nothing away, and a short way with fools and a shorter way with anyone who presumed on him. A man who kept himself apart and asked no one's love and seemed to care for nothing in the world but the cold, hard struggle to keep his ruined house from falling. Cold as the fells, said the neighbors, a hard, proud man with no heart in him, wrapped up in his acres and his pride, and all of it, as such verdicts commonly are, was the truth turned inside out. For the baronet was not heartless, he was only proud, and reserved, and worn hard by long trouble, and honest past the point that comfortable society finds comfortable. He had come to his title young, and to an estate already half ruined by the extravagance of his forebears. And he had spent the whole of his manhood in a grim, lonely, unthanked struggle to save it, denying himself everything, pinching and contriving and laboring like his own steward, carrying alone the whole crushing weight of a great name and a small purse, and the long anxious charge of a beloved dying brother whom he had nursed and shielded for years, and whose life was the one soft place in his hard existence. It had made him hard, and silent, and old before his time. It had shut him up in himself and dried the show of feeling out of him. But it had not killed the deep, strong, honest heart beneath, nor the stern sense of justice that was the bedrock of him, nor the deep and loyal love he bore his brother, nor a capacity for a further deep feeling that he had shown to no one and had all but forgotten in himself. He could not abide a lie, nor a cruelty, nor an injustice. He had a plain, stern rectitude that was the one luxury his poverty had left him, and though he was half mad with grief at his brother's dreadful death, and had in the first horror of it half believed the healer guilty with the rest, for the evidence seemed plain and the doctor was sure and his heart was breaking, there was in him, beneath the cold surface and the grief, something that would not quite lie easy, some stern honest instinct that was troubled, from the first, by the thing that was being done. For Sir Marcus Ashworth, cold and stricken as he was a just man and a noticing one, and even in the anguish of that dreadful morning, something in the business had jarred upon him and would not be still. He had looked once, hard and searching at the accused healer's white steady face as she denied the charge, and he had seen there, or thought he had seen, not the brazen falsehood of a guilty creature, but a plain white shock and a steady truthful denial and a proud grief of her own for the gentle man she had nursed. That did not fit, to his stern reading, the guilt they laid on her. He had marked, too, with a faint cold unease, how very pat and complete the evidence was, how neatly the file and the torn page had been found, and how zealously the doctor's grave hints had prepared them all, and he remembered, with a slow cold stirring at the back of his grieving mind, that it was Vole, and Vole alone, who had first named poison, urged the search, and known just where to look. He put these things by, in the first press of his grief, but they lay in his stern honest mind like small stones in a shoe, and would not let him be. As that dreadful day wore on, and the first blind heat of his grief cooled into a cold and searching sorrow, the trouble in him grew rather than lessened, for his stern soul could not endure the possibility, once it had entered his mind, that an innocent creature might be hanged for his brother's murder while the true murderer went free. He resolved, coldly and privately, that before that young woman was given up to the law he would at the least look into the matter with his own eyes, for a just man, he thought grimly, owes that much even to a poisoner, and everything to his own dead brother, if his brother had been murdered by some other hand than the one they had seized. And in this he was confirmed, that very afternoon, by the one honest outside voice that reached him, for old Dr. Emery Fielding, a retired physician of the district, a shrewd, humane, sensible man who had known the neighborhood for 40 years and had no love for the smooth Cyprian Vole, came to the house on hearing the dreadful news, and said bluntly to the baronet, as one plain man to another, that he had known many a poisoner in his long time, and that this quiet young gentlewoman did not sort with any of them, and that he for one would want a great deal better proof than a file in a chest that any hand might have placed there before he hanged a friendless creature on the word of Cyprian Vole, of whose own honesty, he added grimly, he had never himself thought so highly as the family did. The baronet said little, but the plain good sense of it, from a man he respected and who had no interest to serve, struck home, and hardened the stern unease in him into a settled resolve. And there was one thing more that moved him, though he scarcely owned it to himself, and it was the memory of the woman's face. He was a lonely man, and a starved one in the deep hungers of the heart, though he had long forgotten it, and something in the still white proud endurance of the accused healer. The way she had stood alone and friendless in the midst of them all and denied the charge and grieved for his brother and asked no pity and did not break, had reached without his knowing it some deep buried place in him that had not been touched in years. He put it from him. He told himself it was nothing to the purpose, a mere idle fancy at a time of grief. But the face went with him, the grave gray steady eyes that had met the whole cold house without flinching, and it sharpened his stern unease into something almost like a personal need to know the truth of her. And so, moved by his honest instinct and his stern justice and his love for his murdered brother, and, beneath these, by something he did not name, the cold Baronet of Cairnhowie did the thing that no one else in that house would have troubled to do, and that broke. In the end, the whole cold frame before she was given up to the law, he sought the accused woman herself, and looked at her, and listened to her, and gave her, alone of all the world, the chance to be heard. He came to her in the cold upper room where she had been shut up under guard to wait for the magistrate, and he came alone, and closed the door and stood a moment looking at her with his hard, unreadable dark eyes before he spoke. And Honoria, worn past fear by the day's dreadful blows, rose and faced him steadily, expecting nothing but a fresh reproach. The master come to curse the woman who had murdered his brother, and she was startled past her guard when instead he said in his level quiet voice that he had come to hear what she had to say for herself, plainly with no one by, that the evidence against her was heavy, and he would not deceive her that it was not, and that his brother was dead and someone had murdered him. But that he was not wholly satisfied, and would hear the truth from her own lips before he let the matter go as it stood, and he bade her, gravely, tell him whether she had poisoned his brother, and if she had not, what she knew and what she thought. And something in the plain stern fairness of it, in the unlooked-for justice of the cold hard man who alone of them all would hear her, broke through Honoria's proud reserve and her despair, and she told him the truth, steadily and simply and with the plain unmistakable ring of an honest soul, that she had not poisoned his brother, that she loved and honored the gentle gentleman she had nursed and would have given her own life to save his, that she had given him nothing but what Dr. Pot Vole himself had directed, that she knew nothing of the poison found in her chest nor how the torn page came among her papers, and that she was as innocent as the day, and could prove nothing, but that it was the truth before God, and she would say it though it cost her her life. And she said too one thing more that she had scarcely dared to think and had told no one, that in the last days she had wondered, watching the poor gentleman sink, at the strange turn of his sickness, for it had not seemed to her, with her healer's eye, to run as his old disease should run, and that she had said as much once, quietly to Dr. Vole, and the doctor had put her off sharply for him, and bidden her mind her own still room and leave the physic to him. And the baronet heard her out, in a hard attentive silence, weighing her words with his stern clear judgment, and when she had done, he was silent a long while, and then said, slowly, that he believed her. He had come, he said, half persuaded of her guilt, with his brother dead and his heart against her, but he had watched liars before, and honest folk before, and knew the difference between the two, and he did not believe that the woman before him was a poisoner, and if she were indeed innocent, he told her quietly, then a horrible wrong was being done and his brother's true murderer went free while an innocent woman was to hang for it, and he would not suffer it to stand if there were any way on earth to come at the truth. And he asked her then the question that unlocked everything, whether her father, of whom he had heard as a man of skill and honor, had left her nothing, no paper, no provision, that might serve her in such a strait as this. And Honoria's thoughts flew, of themselves, to the worn old herbal among her poor things, and she remembered her father's grave face and his strange dying words, and she told the baronet slowly of the old book of simples, and of what her father had said, that if ever she were in a true extremity she was to look behind the pressed flower he had named, and do what she found written there, and trust it. She had not looked, she said. She had thought it, in her grief, only a dying man's tender fancy. But she was in a true extremity now. And Sir Marcus Ashworth, who missed nothing, went very still, and said in a low careful voice that a careful loving father who bade his daughter look behind a pressed flower in her last extremity did not, in his experience of men, speak idle fancies, and that she should look now, before him, that they might see together what her father had left her. And so the worn old herbal was fetched from among her poor things by the guard at the door. And there, in the cold upper room, with the grey autumn light failing at the window, Honoria Fenwick turned the close-written leaves of her father's book with trembling fingers until she came to the pressed flower he had named to her, a faded blue flower pressed flat and brown at the edges upon its page. And with the baronet's own penknife, and her own careful healer's hands, she eased the old flower and the thin backing leaf gently up from the page, and behind it, folded to the size of a fingernail, pressed flat all those years against the paper, was a slip of thin paper, covered in her father's small careful hand. And she unfolded it, her fingers not steady at all, and read again, and lifted to the baronet a face gone white and blazing with a wild new hope. For on that slip her father had written the name and the street of a London chemist and analyst, Mr. Josiah Wenlock, and the number of a sealed strong-box lodged there, and the words, "My dearest child, if you are in need or in any wrong, send to this house and open this box. Herein is your surety, and proof against the man who would harm you. Trust the bearer of this token, and be not afraid." Her father had reached out of his grave to arm her, and the cold baronet, reading over her shoulder, understood at once that here was a thread to follow, and the stern trouble in his hard face kindled, for the first time since his brother's death, into the light of a cold, fierce purpose. For here, at last, was the thing that might break the frame. Here was the thread that no one else had troubled to seek. Sir Marcus Ashworth saw the whole shape of it in an instant, with his hard, clear, rapid mind. He did not yet know what was in that London box, but he knew that a careful, honest man, who bade his daughter open it in her last extremity and called it her surety and her proof against one who would harm her, had put something there of weight, and he resolved, on the instant, what must be done. The box must be opened, quickly, quietly, and lawfully, and whatever it held must be brought north and used, before this cruel business was made final and the innocent woman's ruin sealed past mending, and his brother's murderer left safe. And he did a thing then that showed the whole stern quality of him. He did not give her up. He went, that very hour, cold and resolute, to his astonished household and to the doctor, and he told them, in his quiet, unanswerable way, that the still-room mistress should not be sent to the county gaol, nor given to the law, until he had satisfied himself wholly of the truth of the matter, that there were doubts he meant to resolve, that his brother was dead and he would be very sure of the hand before he let any creature hang for it, that he was master in that house, and that he would answer for it. And Cyprian Vole, when he heard of it, felt the first cold breath of a fear he had thought impossible, and set his smooth wits at once to work to undo this dangerous clemency and hurry the thing to its end. But the baronet was immovable, and he kept the accused woman in the house, in a grave, honorable custody, safe for the while from the worst. And he set about, with his cold thoroughness, the fetching up of the truth from London. He did not go himself, for his sudden absence, with his brother newly dead, would have been marked and would have warned the guilty, and he meant to stay and hold the ground and watch. But he had a man, a grave, shrewd, entirely trustworthy man of his own, an old servant of the house named Gideon Marsh, who had served the baronet and his father before him, and was devoted to him past all buying. And this Gideon Marsh he sent posting to London that very night, armed with a careful letter in the baronet's own hand and with the token, for the chemist, her father's slip said, would give up the box only to his daughter or one bearing her authority and the token he named, and Honoria, by the baronet's advice, sent a line in her own hand claiming her father's provision, and, for the token, the little slip itself in her father's writing, that the honest chemist would know. And so Gideon Marsh went south, hard and fast, through the cold October nights, to find the London house of Mr. Josiah Wenlock, and to satisfy that careful man of the justice of the case and the truth of the token, and to have the sealed box opened before a notary as the law and the chemist's own conscience required, and to bring back north with all the speed of the fastest post, whatever it held, and it was a business of some days, for London was far and the roads were hard and the forms must be observed. And those were hard days at the great house on the fells, for the household grieved and buzzed, and Cyprian Vole plotted, and Honoria waited in an agony of hope and dread, and the baronet kept his stern watch, and held them all off and let no one see the fierce anxiety with which he too awaited the word from London, on which an innocent woman's whole life, and his own dead brother's justice, now hung. And Cyprian Vole in those days knew at last the taste of fear, and grew desperate, and began, for the first time in his long smooth career of crime, to make the small mistakes that desperation makes. He could not understand the baronet's obstinacy. He had counted on the thing being over in a day or two. The poisoner seized and carried off, and himself safe and next in the blood with the way to Cairnhow clear before him at last. And this dangerous delay, this keeping of the accused in the house, and this sending of a trusted man on some secret errand, filled him with a cold creeping dread that his masterpiece was somehow going wrong, though he could not see how. He tried, smoothly and urgently, to press for the wretched business to be finished and the law let take its course, to feed afresh the old man's grief and turn it against his kinsman's strange clemency. He redoubled his grave hints against the healer. He even ventured to hint that the master's odd tenderness for a clever poisoner might itself become a scandal. But the baronet met all his smooth urgings with a cold level look and a short word that Vole found he could not pass. And worse than that, the doctor began to feel, in the baronet's hard watchful eye, a cold new attention turned upon himself that he liked not at all. And so, baffled and frightened, he fell back on watching for what the master meant to do, and on holding himself ready, if the worst came, to fly. He did not know of the herbal. He did not dream that the accused had held, by her all this while, a thing that could destroy him, and least of all did he dream that the honest healer he had feared and thought safely dead had reached out of the grave to lodge, in a London strong-box, the very proofs of his old guilt that were now posting north to hang him. He had reckoned every visible piece on the board, the woman's poverty and friendlessness, her healer's knowledge that made her the plausible poisoner, the planted file, the torn page, the united suspicion, the ruin made sure, and found the reckoning perfect. He had overlooked one thing, one only, because he could not see its worth, a shabby old book of dried weeds and country recipes among a poor healer's things, that a dead apothecary's love had made the key to a strong-box, and that held, folded behind a faded flower, the undoing of his whole cold design. He never thought of the herbal at all. That was his error, and it was enough. And here, while the days of waiting wore on, I must tell you what those days did, quietly, beneath the great business of the plot, to Honoria and to the cold baronet who had become her one defender. For the breaking of the frame is the turn of the story, but the heart of it is the two of them, and I would not have you miss it. They were thrown much together now, in the strange grave intimacy of her danger and her defense, for the baronet, having taken her cause in hand, would come to her in those days to tell her what word there was, or that there was none, and, though he would not have owned it, because he found to his own cold astonishment that he wished to. And in that close hard fellowship of trouble and hope and shared grief, for they grieved together, in their different ways, for the gentle man who was dead, and it was a strange strong bond between them. The grave silent baronet and the proud reticent healer came without ever once saying so, to know each other to the bottom, and to be, each to the other, the one true thing in a false and cruel world. He found in her a mind and a spirit he had never looked to find, a cultivation to match his own starved and buried love of better things, a clear brave sense, a fine healer's discernment, a courage under wrong that shamed the softer women he had known, and a gentleness that had not been soured by all the cruelty done her. And she, who had thought never again to trust any creature in that house, found in the cold hard master not the pride the world saw, but a stern deep honesty, a lonely starved heart like her own, and, beneath the grave surface, a capacity for a deep and gentle feeling that he had shown, she began to see, to no one living. She saw how hard his life had been, and how alone. And how he had loved the brother he had lost. He saw how brave hers was, and how wronged, and each in the other, found for the first time in a long starved while someone who understood. He was too proud, and too honorable, and too careful of her helpless state, to speak a word of love to a woman who was his prisoner and his dependent and whose rescue lay in his hand. He would have died before he used her extremity to press a suit upon her, but she felt it, in his grave care, and the way his hard face gentled when he looked at her, and the fierce quiet anger on her behalf that broke sometimes through his coldness, and she knew, in her own heart, with a wonder that steadied her through those dreadful days, that she was coming to love him too. This cold, clear, honest man who had believed her when all the world condemned her and had set his whole strength between her and the gallows for no reward. And the knowledge, unspoken between them, was a warmth at the center of the cold, and it held them both. Word came from London on the 5th day, and it was better, far better, than even the Baronet had dared to hope. Gideon Marsh returned, gray with hard travel and grim with a triumph he could scarcely contain, bearing the strong box's whole contents sealed up under the notary's hand and the chemist's, and Sir Marcus Ashworth, opening them in private with Honoria at his side and his stern face for once alight, found in them not one weapon but two, and the second was the thunderbolt. The first was Honoria's own vindication, sure and clear, her father's own plain written account and vouchers of the honest facts of her life, enough to establish past cavil her good character and the falseness of the charge, a shield of proven respectability to set against the brand of a murderess. But the second thing was the ruin of Cyprian Vole, and more than the ruin of him, for it was the very key to the murder that had just been done. For there, in that London box, kept these several years by the foresight of the honest healer who had never forgotten a murderer, was the whole clear proof of Cyprian Vole's old and secret guilt, the letter in Vole's own hand, written years before in the matter of that fatal draught, that said far too much and betrayed the whole, and Reuben Fenwick's own dated exact memorandum, setting out the history of the poisoning he had detected, and most deadly of all, his own careful written analysis, plain for any honest chemist to confirm, of just how a certain harmless-seeming draught had been, and might be, secretly meddled with into a slow and deadly poison, and of the very signs by which such a poisoning might afterward be known. A full, damning record that the trusted and faithful Dr. Cyprian Vole, physician of the Ashworths, was and had long been a poisoner and a cheat. And the Baronet, reading it with his hard, clear head, saw the whole matter open before him in a cold blaze of understanding. Here was proof that the very man who had first cried poison, and urged the search, and found the file so pat, was himself a proven poisoner of years' standing, with the strongest reason on earth both to gain the inheritance that one ailing life stood between him and to silence the child of the man who could expose his old crime. And the analysis in the dead healer's hand gave the Baronet, and would give a magistrate and any honest doctor, the very means to prove, upon the poor dead gentleman himself, that he had died as Reuben Fenwick's paper described, by the secret meddling of his physic. The Baronet put this proof of Vole's old murder beside his own dark memory of who it was that had cried poison and known where to look, and reached, with a cold certainty, the truth, that Vole had poisoned Lucian himself, to come into the inheritance and cover his debts, and had framed the innocent woman to hide his crime and be rid of the one person who might expose him. He could not in that first hour prove every step with a paper, but he had proof enough of Vole's old murder and his motive and his lies to break the frame utterly, to clear Honoria, and to turn the whole force of the inquiry, with a magistrate and an honest physician behind it, upon the true culprit, and he had no doubt at all that once the hunt was turned upon Vole, the rest would follow, the very poison and the debts and the whole dreadful truth, and hang the man. Sir Marcus Ashworth looked at the papers spread on the table, the proof that cleared her and the proof that damned her enemy and would avenge his brother, and then he looked at Honoria's white blazing face. And for the first time in all their acquaintance something like a grim and terrible resolve settled in his hard eyes, He had his weapon now, he had it whole, and he had only to choose the time and the manner to strike, so that it should do the most complete and the most public and the most final work, and clear the wronged woman and unmask the murderer before the very household that had condemned her and avenge the gentle man they had all failed. And he chose, with a cold sense of justice that was almost terrible, to make the exposure absolute and the vindication certain, and public and past all undoing. He would call the household together, and he would bring the law, in the person of the county magistrate, to be present, and he would have present to old Dr. Fielding, the one honest physician who had doubted from the first. And there, before them all, before his servants and the assembled house that had branded her a poisoner, he would produce the proof of Cyprian Vole's old guilt, and lay bare his motive and his lies, and turn the whole matter inside out, and clear Honoria Fenwick's name in the sight of all who had blackened it, and set the law upon the true murderer at the very moment of his fancied safety. It was a stern plan, and a just one, and it asked of Honoria a little more patience, a little more of the hard waiting she had borne so long. But she had courage, and she trusted the grave man who had become, though neither of them yet spoke of it, so much more to her than her defender, and she held her nerve, and waited for the hour. The day came, a hard bright autumn day with the light lying clear and pitiless over the great house and the brown fells beyond, and Sir Marcus Ashworth had made his quiet preparations, and brought his people together in the great cold hall, and had the county magistrate present, a solid, upright, sensible gentleman named Sir Cuthbert Vane, whom the baronet had privately begged to attend on a grave matter touching the honor of the house and the doing of justice and the death of his brother, and who did not yet know the whole of what he had been brought to see, and old Dr. Emery Fielding stood grave and watchful at his side, brought to confirm, with his honest skill, what the dead healer's paper set out. The household was there, the servants ranged and murmuring, all agog at this strange solemn summons and this grave presence of the law. And Cyprian Vole was there, smooth and grave and outwardly composed in his sober physician's black, but with a cold sick fear gnawing beneath his calm, for he could not tell what this meant, and every instinct of the hunted murderer in him was screaming that something had gone terribly wrong. And Honoria Fenwick was there, pale and still, brought in by the baronet's order, standing quietly apart, her father's worn old herbal, for the first time held openly in her two hands before them all, outwardly a disgraced woman brought to hear her doom, inwardly a soul strung tight with hope and dread, waiting for the grave cold man to keep his word. And when they were assembled, and the murmuring had stilled, Sir Marcus Ashworth stood up before them all, in the cold bright hall, and spoke. In his level voice that carried to every corner of it, he said that he had brought them together, and had begged the presence of Sir Cuthbert Vane as a magistrate, because a grave and a horrible wrong had been done in that house, over and above the death of his beloved brother, and he meant to see it all set right before them all, that the young gentlewoman lately accused among them of the poisoning had been, he was now assured past all doubt, falsely and wickedly accused, and that he would show them, then and there, by proof they could not gainsay, both that she was innocent, and by whose hand the true guilt lay, and that the same hand had done the murder and built the lie. And there fell on that hall a silence like the silence after a thunderclap, and every face turned, and Cyprian Vole by the great hearth went slowly gray, and gripped the back of a chair, and fought to keep his smooth face still. And the baronet, quite unmoved, turned to the magistrate, and to the company, and told them all. He told it plainly and coldly and completely, and he had the proofs in his hand. He told them first how he had doubted, from the first, the two pat evidence and the strange zeal of the accusation, and how it was one man who had cried poison and urged the search and known just where to look, how he had sought the accused woman out and heard her, and believed her, and how she had put into his hands the thread that led to the truth, her dead father's provision, lodged against just such a day in a sealed box with a London chemist. And then he produced the papers that Gideon Marsh had brought north, and laid bare, before them all, the whole hidden history, how the late Mr. Reuben Fenwick, an honest healer of unimpeachable name, had years before detected a certain man in a secret poisoning and a false certificate of a death, in the matter of a legacy, and had secured the proofs of it, a letter in that man's own hand and his own careful analysis and memorandum, and had lodged them at last in the London box, as a protection for his child against the very man, and that the man so proved a poisoner and a cheat. In his own hand, before them all, was— and here the baronet turned his cold level eyes full upon the grey and shaking physician doctor, Cyprian Vole. And he held up the letter, and the dead man's memorandum, and the analysis, and put them into the hands of the astonished magistrate, and bade old Dr. Fielding read out and confirm what the analysis set forth. Here was the man who had first cried poison over the dying heir, and dropped his hints against the healer for weeks before ever the death was done, the man who had urged the search, and been so ready to know where the phial would be found, the man who of all the household had the freest hand with the sick man's physic, and here was that same man proved, out of the grave by his own victim's father, a secret poisoner of years' standing, with the strongest reason under heaven to wish the child of the man who held his guilt silenced forever, and, the baronet added, in a voice gone terrible, with a reason nearer and greater still, for who, he asked them, stood next in the blood of that house after the poor gentleman who lay dead, and would come, by that death, into Cairnhow itself? Let them look at the man who gained a fortune by the murder and had framed a friendless woman to hide it. And Dr. Fielding, grave and sure, confirmed from the dead healer's analysis that the signs of poor Lucian Ashworth's dying were the very signs there set down of such a secret meddling, and no natural end of his old disease at all. And the baronet asked them, coldly, which was now the likelier poisoner, the friendless gentlewoman who had loved and nursed the dead man and against whom there was nothing but a phial that any hand might have placed in her chest, or the proven poisoner and trusted physician, who had the means, the opportunity, and the treble motive, to gain the inheritance, to cover his debts, and to destroy the one person he most needed silenced? And then, while they were still reeling from it, the baronet dealt the last stroke, the one that broke Cyprian Vole past all mending. He said that, having doubted the doctor in more than this, he had that very morning, quietly and with the magistrate's authority, caused Dr. Vole's own rooms and his private medicine case and his locked cabinet to be secured and searched, and that there had been found, and he had it brought in then and set upon the table before them all, the very phial and the store of the secret poison that had killed the heir, the fellow to the one planted in the healer's chest, hidden among the doctor's private things, together with certain papers of his debts, the pressing bond and the threatening letters of his creditors, that showed to all the world the desperate need that had driven him to murder for an inheritance. And there it lay, the poison and the proof of the debts, upon the dark table in the cold bright light, the proof of everything, the very poison in the true poisoner's own keeping. And a great gasp and then a great murmur went round the hall, and every eye turned, cold now and terrible, upon Cyprian Vole. And the smooth plausible man, exposed in his own old crime and caught with the very poison and the ruinous debts that named his motive, his masterpiece shattered, and the gallows itself opening before him, lost, for the only time in his hard smooth life, his cold command of himself. He blustered, and denied, and then, seeing the poison on the table and the horror on every face turning now against him, he broke, and cried out, and would have fled, but the baronet's men were at the doors. And Sir Cuthbert Vane, grave and terrible now in his office, laid the law's hand upon him, and Cyprian Vole, the smooth murderer who had poisoned the heir to inherit and reached to ruin an innocent woman to save his own neck, was taken, then and there a detected felon to answer for the whole of it before the law. And it all came out, in the days that followed, the old poisoning and the debts and the murder and the wicked frame, the whole cold history of his crimes unraveled at last. And Cyprian Vole was carried away to his trial and his ruin, undone utterly, ruined by the one thing his cold reckoning had never thought to search. and Honoria Fenwick stood in the cold bright hall, in her plain gown, with her father's old herbal in her hands. Cleared. Cleared before them all. Cleared in the sight of the very household that had branded her a poisoner. Her innocence proved. Her good name restored. The true murderer unmasked and taken. The gentleman she had nursed avenged. And the whole cruel frame that had been built around her broken to pieces before the eyes of all who had believed it. The old baronet, her master, his hard, proud face working with shame and grief and horror, sat stricken and silenced, forced to see how nearly he had helped to hang an innocent creature, and how he had been played all along by the smooth kinsman he had trusted with his brother's very life. And one by one the household, that had been so cold and so sure, looked now upon the wronged healer with a shamed and wondering respect, and some of them with tears. And Honoria, who had borne so much with so still a courage, felt the long dreadful strain break in her at last, and stood trembling, hardly able to believe that it was over, that she was cleared, that the shadow of the rope was lifted from her, and she lifted her eyes, across all that murmuring hall, to the one face she sought, the grave cold face of the man who had believed her when all the world condemned her, and had set his whole strength between her and the gallows, and she saw in his hard eyes, meeting hers, a look that no one else there could read, and that told her, without a word, everything. She did not fall into the baronet's arms, and he did not ask her to, and that is the last and best thing to know of them, for it is the whole meaning of her story. She was cleared now, and free, and her good name her own again, but she was still a poor gentle woman with her way to make, and he was still the proud master of the house where she had been so wronged, and a house of fresh grief and mourning, and he was too honorable, and too proud, and too careful of her to press his suit in the hour of her rescue, when she was too newly cleared and too beholden to say him a fair no. He did a thing then instead, that showed the whole stern quality of him and won her more surely than any wooing could have done. He saw to her vindication being made complete and public, so that her good name should stand clear not in that house only but in the county and the world. He pressed upon her, gravely, such amends as he could make, and would have settled on her, in reparation, a sum that would have kept her in modest independence all her days, and he offered with a grave delicacy to help her to whatever future she might choose, entirely as she wished and owing him nothing. And then, having done all this, he did the hardest and the finest thing of all. He set her free. He told her, quietly, that she was cleared, and independent and her own woman, free to make what life she chose, with no claim upon her from him or any other, that he asked, and would take, nothing for what he had done, and that if she should ever, of her own free choice, wish to see him again, on whatever footing she herself named, she had only to send him word, and he would come, but that until she sent it, she should hear nothing from him that could weigh, by so much as a feather, upon a freedom he had helped her win. And then he saw her, with grave care, safely and honorably away from the great house that had used her so ill, to a decent lodging in the town and the ordering of her own restored life, and he left her free. And she took her freedom, and she used it, and she found it good. She was no longer the friendless creature who had come to the great house in the spring. She came out of that dreadful autumn cleared and vindicated and, by the baronet's amends, modestly provided, a gentlewoman with her good name shining the brighter for the trial it had passed through, and her own life in her own hands at last. She settled quietly, in a pleasant town not far off, among a few old friends of her father's who welcomed the honest healer's daughter with a warm respect. She took up again, in a small way, the gentle healing and the quiet study that had been her father's gift to her, doctoring the poor as he had done, and she drew, for the first time since his death, a free and easy breath in a world that had so nearly closed on her forever. And she thought in that free quiet time, long and honestly, about the grave cold man who had believed her when no one else would, and had broken her ruin and asked nothing and set her free, and she found, thinking of him with her whole clear mind and her whole freed heart, that she loved him, not out of gratitude, though she was deeply grateful, and not out of need. For she needed no one now but freely, and wholly, and of her own certain choosing, for the stern honesty and the lonely strength, and the hidden gentle heart of him, and for the way he had, alone of all the world, seen her true and believed her and loved her enough to set her free. And when she was quite sure of it, quite sure that it was her own free heart and not the shadow of her rescue that spoke, she sent him word. It was a short letter, and a grave one, and it said only that she would be glad to see him again, on the footing of two free and equal friends, whenever he should care to come. And Sir Marcus Ashworth, who had waited in a hard patience she never fully knew, came, and this time there was no frame, and no fear, and no false accusation, and no dependence. There were only two proud, lonely, honest souls who had each found, late and unlooked for, the one other creature in the world they could wholly trust and wholly love, meeting now freely and as equals on the far side of the storm. He came, through that winter and the spring that followed, often, and they walked and talked out of the whole of their two deep minds and two starved strong hearts, and the love between them, that had been forged in trouble and shared grief and left to grow in freedom, deepened and steadied into a quiet certain thing that needed no declaring, and yet was declared, at last, quite simply. One soft evening in the early spring, when he told her, gravely, that he had loved her since the day he saw her stand alone and wronged before them all and grieve for his brother and not break, and had held his peace until she should be free enough to hear it as a free woman, and asked her, not as a rescuer to a rescued, but as an equal to an equal, whether she would have him. And Honoria Fenwick, who was mistress now of her own restored life, and her own good name and needed nothing any man could give her, said yes, freely and gladly, and of her own full choosing, because she loved him, and for no other reason under heaven, and gave herself, not as a wronged creature rescued, nor a poor dependent raised, but as a free woman choosing, the one gift that is worth nothing unless it is given free. They were married in the summer, quietly, and she went to the great house on the fells not as the friendless still-room mistress who had been branded a poisoner in its cold hall, but as its mistress and its lady, come freely and honored and beloved to the very place of her worst wrong. And the hall that had rung with her false accusation saw her come into it now, on the arm of the man she had freely chosen, as its lady. And the old baronet, her former master, humbled and softened by all that had passed, and by the plain proof of how he had wronged the young woman, and been deceived in the doctor who had killed his brother, received his new sister with a stiff broken kindness that was, for that hard grieving old man, a kind of atonement. And the household that had once closed against the poisoner opened now, glad and ashamed and loyal, to the wronged lady come to her own. And the great house, that had been so cold and so darkened by grief, grew warm, for the baronet's long lonely struggle was eased at last, not by any fortune, but by the coming into it of a heart that understood his own, and the two of them, each so long alone, made of that grim old place, and of the ordering of the estate, and the quiet doctoring of the poor about it that she took up as its lady, a shared and a happy work, and were, in the deep quiet way of two reserved souls who have found their one true mate, as happy as ever two people were. She lived long and honored and beloved, the once branded healer of the great house, its lady now and mistress of a great heart, cleared and free, and loved. And she kept to the end of her long life two faithful customs that those who loved her understood and strangers did not. She kept always, and used always, and would to her death, her father's worn old herbal, its hidden slip long since taken out and kept apart, and its secret long since spent, but the plain book of simples itself dearer to her than any jewel she owned, for the healing it taught, and the Father's hand that had written it, and the Father's love it had carried, and the vindication it had, all unregarded, unlocked, and she doctored the poor of the estate out of it, as her father had done before her, and would take it sometimes in her hand, in quiet moments, and be still, remembering the gentle foreseeing man who had armed his motherless girl against a danger he could only guess at, and had hidden her rescue in the one thing a schemer would never think to search. And she set it down for those who should come after her, the whole plain truth of her story, that none who loved her should ever forget it. How the friendless and the poor may be made to bear the crimes of the plausible and the powerful. How a proud hard man's plain love of justice had refused to let a wrong stand when all the world was content that it should, and how a woman with a clear mind and a steady courage and a father's care behind her had borne a false and a deadly brand without breaking, and waited, and been cleared at last, and how there are things a murderer will never think to search because he cannot see their worth, and the plain worn book a hard man passes over as mere sentiment may be the one key that unlocks the strong box where his whole cold design lies waiting to be undone. And on the one day in all the year that was the anniversary of that cold, bright morning in the great hall, when the truth was read out and her name given back to her before all the world, the Lady of Cairnhow would go alone, in the evening, to the quiet of her own room, and take out the worn old herbal and turn its close-written leaves by candlelight, and be still a while, with the memory of her gentle father, and the wonder of her own hard-won deliverance, and the deep sure love of the grave clear-eyed man who had believed her when all the world would have condemned her, and had loved her enough to set her free before he ever asked her to be his. That was the whole of Honoria's story, the poisoned heir and the false accusation and the smooth murderer who reached to ruin her, and the father's foresight and the cold master's justice that broke the frame, and the plain worn book of simples that held the key when all the visible world was against her. And if you have stayed by her side to the end of it, as I asked you at the first to do, then you have seen the thing I have been waiting all this while to tell you, which is that the truth of an honest soul is worth more than all the evidence a liar can plant against it, and will out at the last if there is but one just man to seek it, and that a good man's foresight can reach out of the grave to arm the child he loves, and that there are things worth more than a schemer can see, hidden in what he passes over, waiting only for the day of need. And so the candle burns low on another tale. Stay a while in the quiet, and tell me in the comments whether she chose rightly.